Hello, this is Perfectly Wonderful Stories for Perfectly Wonderful Children, and you are very welcome. This is one of my son's favourite stories, A Tale of Sooty and Snowy, and I'd like to read it to you. A Tale of Sooty and Snowy by Enid Blyton. Down at the toy shop there was a big black cat with eyes as green as cucumbers. She belonged to Mrs. Kindly, who owned the toy shop, and her name was Comfy. This may seem an odd name for a cat, but it was exactly right for Mrs. Kindly's cat. Comfy looked just like her name, cosy and comfortable and warm. All the children loved her. Comfy used to sit on the counter near the teddy bears and fluffy rabbits, and the boys and girls stroked her when they came into the shop. Two children liked her especially. They were a brother and sister called Robert and Ruth. They always stroked Comfy to make her purr. She had a very loud purr indeed. Purr, purr. "It's as loud as Mummy's sewing machine," said Robert. Mrs. Kindly always liked to see Robert and Ruth in her toy shop. They were so nice to one another. They seemed to share everything. They even shared stroking the big black cat. "It's your turn to stroke her now," Ruth would say to Robert. If they ever had any money to spend, they shared it out between them too. "Our uncle gave me a 6-penny piece," said Robert, "and he gave Ruth a box of sweets, Mrs. Kindly. So Ruth shared the sweets with me, and now I'm going to share the 6pence with her. That's 3pence each. Have you anything for 3pence? "It's a pity more brothers and sisters aren't like you two," said Mrs. Kindly. "Now take John and Jane, the unkind things they say to one another. And Peter and Pam, why, I had to send them out the shop, they quarrelled so the other day." Now one day, Comfy the cat wasn't on the toy counter with the rabbits and the bears when Robert and Ruth came in. "Oh, where's Comfy?" asked Ruth. "I'll show you," said Mrs. Kindly, and she took Robert and Ruth to the little room at the back of her shop. By the fire was a cosy blanket, and in it was the big black cat Comfy. She purred loudly when she saw the two children. "Purr. Look what she's got in her basket," said Mrs. Kindly to the children. Ruth gave a squeal. "Kittens! Oh, how many! Aren't they simply lovely?" "She's got 2, said Mrs. Kindly. "And the odd thing is, one is black just like Comfy herself, and the other is white. They will make a pretty pair later on." The kittens were very tiny. They hadn't even got their eyes open yet. They snuggled up to their big, soft mother, and she licked them lovingly. After that, of course, Robert and Ruth came to see the kittens every single day. They watched them grow, and they were glad when they opened their blue eyes. Then the kittens began to crawl about the basket and make funny little squeaky mewy noises. The children loved them. They told their mother about the kittens, and Comfy the cat talked about the two children in new language to her kittens. "Meow meow, they're very nice children," she told the kittens. "Brother and sister, just like you are, Snowy and Sooty. And you must see, meow, that you are kind and good to one another, as Robert and Ruth are, meow." She didn't really need to tell the two kittens that, because they loved one another from the first day they opened their eyes and saw each other. They played and cuddled together, and shared the ball of wool that Mrs. Kindly found for them to play with. When they were old enough, they drank milk, and they shared the same saucer, and they ran everywhere together. "We should really call them Robert and Ruth," said Mrs. Kindly to the two children one day. "They are just like you two, dear little Snowy and Sooty. I shall be sorry when I have to sell them. So will their mother cat, she loves them so." Comfy was upset when she heard Mrs. Kindly say that. Goodness gracious, so her kittens would be sold. And not only that, the two would be parted from one another. One would go to one home and the other to another home. They might not ever see each other again. Snowy and Sooty cuddled together and mewed into each other's very ears. "Meow,
let's always keep together. Meow, let's not go to different homes. Meow, let's stay together like Robert and Ruth.
But oh dear, Mrs. Kindly soon put a notice on her window. It said, 2 beautiful kittens for sale, 1 white, 1 black.
Meow, soon you will be parted now, said their mother to them sadly. Meow, nobody generally wants 2 cats, so make the most of one another because you never know when someone will come in and buy one of you. Meow.
Robert and Ruth saw the notice in the shop window. They did hope nobody would buy the kittens yet. They were really so sweet now. Robert loved Sooty and Ruth loved Snowy, the white one. Each child took up a kitten and petted it. I should hate to hear that someone has brought Snowy and taken her away, said Ruth, her voice trembling. I do love her so. And I shall hate to know that someone has brought Sooty, said Robert. He's so amusing and so quick and so cheeky. I do love him so. Now, when Robert got home that day, he went to his money box to see how much money he had. The 2 kittens were 2 shillings and 6pence each. If he had 5 shillings, he would be able to buy them both. But he only had half a crown, made up of a shilling, 2 sixpences and a 3 bit, and 3 pennies. And by the time he could save up another 2 shillings and 6pence, both kittens would have been sold. He thought longingly of Sooty, black as soot, green-eyed now that his mother, playfully and lovingly, he had enough to buy just him. But Ruth loved Snowy. If he were going to buy a kitten, he would have to buy Snowy for Ruth, because Ruth loved her. She would be disappointed if he bought Sooty. Oh, it was a puzzle what to do. He went out to sit in the shed and think about it. When he was gone, Ruth came running into the playroom, and she took down her money box. She had had exactly the same thought as Robert. Had she enough money to buy both the kittens? That would be lovely. She counted out her money. 2 shillings, a 6pence, 3 threepenny bits and a penny. I've no idea how much that is. How much was that? Surely it would be nearly 5 shillings. But it wasn't, of course. It was only 3 shillings and 4pence. Oh, what a shame. Ruth put the money back. Then she too went out to think about things in the woodshed. Robert had just gone. Ruth sat down and thought just the same thoughts as Robert. If I buy Snowy for myself, oh, and I do so love Snowy, Robert will wish that it was Sooty, because he loves Sooty. But I haven't got enough money for both. Ooh. She thought again, sitting on a pile of sacks, frowning. And then she jumped up. Well, I love Snowy, but I love Robert more. I will go and buy him Sooty for a very great surprise. Oh, how pleased he'll be. Her mother called to her just as she ran indoors to get her money. Ruth, just come here and help me untangle some wool for a minute. Where's Robert? Asked Ruth, holding out her hands for the wool. He ran out in a hurry, said her mother. He said he was going to the village for something. Well, I don't know whether you can guess where Robert had gone. Yes, to the toy shop. He was going to buy Sooty because he loved him so, right? No, he wasn't. He was going to buy Snowy for Ruth. What a pair! Robert wanted Sooty, but he was going to buy Snowy instead. And Ruth wanted Snowy, but she was going to buy Sooty because Robert loved him so. Robert was in the toy shop with his money in his hand. He spoke eagerly to Mrs. Kindly. Mrs. Kindly, has anyone bought Snowy yet? Because I want to buy her. Nobody's bought Snowy, said Mrs. Kindly. But dear me, Robert, I thought it was Sooty you so did love. Yes, I do, but I'm buying Snowy for Ruth. Please don't say a word, Mrs. Kindly. It's a big surprise. Well, well, said Mrs. Kindly. You're a generous fellow, Robert. We'll go and get Snowy now. Dear me, oh, the 2 kittens will be sad to part. They're just as much to one another as you and Ruth are. Snowy was picked up and put into a basket with a lid. Mrs. Kindly lent it to Robert to take Snowy home safely. Snowy mewed loudly. Meow,
Sooty. Oh, Sooty, meow. I do hope we see each other again. Meow. Goodbye.
There, she's saying goodbye to her mother, said Mrs. Kindly, and to her brother. How those kittens will miss each other. Robert carried the kitten home carefully, sorry for Sooty left behind, but glad to think of how delighted Ruth would be. He went in at the back door just as Ruth ran out of the front one, her money clutched in her hand. She had finished untangling the wool and was going to buy Sooty for Robert. She ran to the toy shop and burst in the door.
Mrs. Kindly, she said, has anyone bought Sooty? Please, I do so want to buy him.
But I thought you liked Snowy, said Mrs. Kindly. Oh, I do. But Robert loves Sooty, you see. I'm buying him for Robert. I've only got enough money for one kitten. Mrs. Kindly led the way to the room at the back of the shop. Sooty was there, alone with his mother, mewing sadly.
Where's Snowy? Asked Ruth. Oh, has someone bought darling little Snowy? Oh, I did so want to say goodbye to her before anyone took her. Oh, poor little Sooty. He's missing Snowy already. Oh dear, if only I had enough money to have bought both kittens. Has Snowy gone to somebody kind, Mrs. Kindly?
Dear me, yes, said Mrs. Kindly, to one of the kindest persons I know. Smiling and longing to tell Ruth who had taken Snowy, but Robert had asked her to keep his secret. So she didn't tell Ruth any more. The little girl borrowed the basket from Mrs. Kindly, and Sooty was put into it, mewing loudly.
Oh, he wants Snowy, said Ruth, almost in tears. Don't cry, Sooty. I want Snowy too, but there wasn't enough money.
She took Sooty home carefully. She carried him into the playroom, where she could hear Robert whistling. She held the basket behind her back, her eyes shining. And there was Robert holding something behind his back too. It was the basket with Snowy in it. He had been anxiously waiting for Ruth to come back.
I've got a present for you. Guess what it is, said Ruth.
And I've got one for you. Guess what it is? Well, they didn't have to guess, because at that very moment, Sooty and Snowy smelt one another's furry smell and mewed in excitement, meow, meow, calling to each other, meow, meow. And when the children put the two baskets on the table, out jumped Sooty and Snowy, who ran to each other at once, rolling over and over in delight.
Oh, why, you've bought Sooty, cried Robert joyfully. Oh, and you've bought Snowy, said Ruth. Oh, Robert, I did so wonder who had got Snowy. And it was you. Oh, you bought her for me. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Mother came in to hear what all the excitement was about. And how surprised was she to see a snowy white kitten and a sooty black kitten playing together in her home.
What a lovely pair, she said.
Whose are they?
Ours, said Robert and Ruth together. Oh, Mummy, we're so happy.
So were the two kittens. They couldn't believe that they weren't to be parted after all. Robert and Ruth still have them, and they've grown into lovely big cats now, and they often sit on the windowsill inside the sitting room side by side, and passers-by see them and stare. What a pretty pair, they say. There ought to be a story about them. And so there ought, and that's why I've written one for you. And that's why she wrote that story for you, and I hope you liked it as much as my son did. Have a lovely day. Goodbye.